Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this online gathering today. I know that it's different times in different parts of the country and that you are gathered from across the country and possibly even from further afield. So wherever you are and whatever time it is, a very warm welcome. My name is Peter Carroll. I'm the Provincial of the Marist Brothers and currently the President of Catholic Religious Australia. And it is wonderful to have you here for the third and final of our Catalysts for Conversation, which is a series in which we have been exploring that rich resource, the Light from the Southern Cross report, which made recommendations about the governance of our diocese and Catholic entities in Australia. Today's Catalyst for Conversation is entitled Accountability and Transparency. And we're delighted to have two speakers today, Claire Victory and Susan Pascoe. And Anne Walker, the Executive National Director of CRA, will introduce them in much more detail after these preliminary words. I hope that the next few hours together, as we listen and reflect and share our thoughts and hopes, is beneficial for you and enjoyable and informative. I'm sure it will be. So thank you for making the effort to be here with one another and with our speakers for this Catalyst for Conversation today. I will begin, as we always do, with an acknowledgement of country. And I invite you, as we go through this acknowledgement, to possibly enter the name of the country on which you are in the chat. So, on our behalf, I pay respect to and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us gathers today. And I also, on our behalf, pay respects to elders, both past, present, and emerging, for their care of our land. And so, let us pray. Gracious God, open our hearts and minds this day that we may hear your voice deeply. Send your Spirit in our midst to bring new understandings and lead us closer into relationship with Christ and to the transformation of our life. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. I'd now introduce our facilitator for this Catalyst for Conversation, entitled Accountability and Transparency, and that is Anne Walker. Anne is the National Executive Director of Catholic Religious Australia. She conducts the Secretariat and has come to us with broad experience in both corporate and church life. And it's a delight to have Anne, who is going to facilitate, run our program and introduce our speakers. So thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to all of you for this, the third session of the Catalysts for Conversation, to unpack some aspects of the Light from the Southern Cross report. Some of you are continuing in this series and others of you are new for the conversation today. You're all very welcome. As you would know, Catholic Religious Australia is the national conference of leaders of religious institutes and societies of apostolic life across Australia. But COVID presented us with an opportunity to have conversations online and therefore open up the conversations that would normally just occur with our members, but to send out the invitation much more broadly to be inclusive of the wider people of God. So we have a variety of participants here today. The series of conversations arose from the report of the Light from the Southern Cross, and we talked about how we could open up that report in a way that encouraged individuals to look at the relevance in their own mission in the church, as well as, of course, within the structural piece of the church. Our conversations began in July last year, and when we were planning, the plenary council, even the first assembly, seemed ages away, and here we are now, 10 months later, with the second assembly upon us. And some of you today will be members of the plenary council, but as others of you, probably most of you aren't. But I know that everyone here today is here because they're vitally interested in the church, in what the church could be, how the church should be, and to have that conversation about possibilities. Now, Light from the Southern Cross arose from one of the specific recommendations of the Royal Commission, 1617, I think, and specifically in that recommendation where the church, it was recommended the church undertake a review of governance of parishes and dioceses. The recommendation specifically referred to including accountability and transparency. So we know it's a significant part of church life, but we also know in secular life, church accountability and transparency is so important. When we planned these conversations, we looked at some key themes, and we broke the conversations into 3 parts looking at those key themes. The first one was mission and church, and we had Richard Bernard, John Warhurst and Mel Dwyer speak. We had then as the second theme as co-responsibility and synodality, and we had Orm Rush, Shane McKinlay and Teresa Brearley speak in November. And now we find ourselves in our third conversation, and we're very pleased to have Susan Pascoe and Claire Victory speak with us today. And just to let you know, I have Sylvia McCutcheon-Hook and Taylor Patino in here in the office with me supporting this event. So thank you to both of you. They're off camera, we can't move the camera. So now we begin. And I'll start by introducing you to Susan and then Claire. Sylvia's reminded me to let you know the format for today. We'll start with the keynote presentations of Susan and Claire. Then we'll have a break, the purpose of which is to actually give you time to reflect on what you've heard, what it's raised for you, what questions it may have raised in you. Obviously, it may be time for some lunch for those of us on the East Coast, and also perhaps to look at some emails. But the time is allowed to actually encourage you to take the time and space to reflect and see where the Spirit moves you. And then after that time, we'll come back for a group discussion where a question will be given to the speaker to comment, and then you're going to break out groups to talk about the same question with some feedback afterwards, which I'll explain to you how that will work. It's the same format as previously for those who've joined us before. And then a second question put to the speaker. And we'll follow that same format with the second speaker, Claire. Excuse me. If you've got questions, please send them to Sylvia at that email address on the screen, and she has already sent you the email previously as well. We'd ask you to keep your microphone on mute so that everyone can hear. And we will, is there anything else on the housekeeping? Lovely. So we can begin with Susan. And I'm very pleased to welcome Susan to this conversation with CRA. Susan is an adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia. She wears many hats as you can see from her bio on the screen, and has contributed broadly to the church and secular society. She chairs the Australian Council for International Development, Community Directors Council, and Catholic Emergency Relief Australia. She's a member of the Vatican's Commission for Methodology Planning, the Synod on Synodality, a trustee of St John God of Health, and a board member of Mercy Health. She was a member of the Governance Review Project Team, which was established by the ACBC and CRA and produced this report, The Light from the Southern Cross. She's also principal of Kadisha Enterprises Consultancy. Susan was the inaugural commissioner for the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. Her entire career, her earlier career was in education, including roles as chair of the Catholic Education Commission of Victoria and CEO of the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority. She's chaired the Australian National Commission for UNESCO and was a patron for the Melbourne Parliament for the World's Religions. She's a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, the Institute of Public Administration of Australia, and the Australian College of Educators. Her significant achievements were acknowledged in 2007 when she was appointed member of the Order of Australia. In November 2016, she was awarded the Leadership in Government Award for her outstanding contribution to public administration in Australia. So you can see I certainly needed my glasses to read the many achievements that Susan has reached throughout her career. Her topic today is the contribution of all the people of God to a co-responsible, transparent, vibrant church. A wonderful topic, Susan, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I will now share the screen. I'll just... And am I on the...
Just give it a moment. Yep, that's good, Susan. Thank you.
Lovely. All right. Well, look, I'm delighted to be here and the third in this sequence of sessions and commend CRA for taking the time really to delve a bit more deeply into this report. What I'm going to be doing in the 20 minutes that I've got is to give you a little bit of the context of the report, because I do think that that's important and still relevant, and Anne made reference to it in her introductory remarks, to look at some of the findings that come from that report in relation to accountability and transparency. And then between us, I think we'll try and tease out what those issues mean for those working in church entities. There may be some who are participants from parish and diocese. I suspect the majority are working in a range of ministries, whether they're through public juridic persons or religious institute entities and so on. What you'll see, by the way, as I go through, is a series of images mostly taken at the seaside, mostly taken by friends who've given me permission to use them. But with the well-quoted, it's almost an adage, I suppose, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I'm trying to move us through a series of images that take us from perhaps a darker environment into a lighter one. And so there's the first of them. It's actually taken at Point Lonsdale at a fairly sombre sky, a blue-black sky there. As Anne mentioned, one of the backgrounds to this piece of work was a key recommendation from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse that the ACBC conduct a national review of the governance and management structures of dioceses and parishes, including in relation to issues of transparency, accountability, consultation and the participation of lay men and women. This review should draw from the approaches to governance of Catholic health, community services and education agencies. Interesting in that it's clearly that a significant deficit, governance deficit, was seen in diocesan rather than in religious institute structures and practices. And in addition to singling out health, community services and education, which of course are significantly government funding and subject to acquittal and governance procedures as part of those contracts, but nonetheless have been operating in different authority structures. In addition to that, in the text around this recommendation, there was reference made to the governance principles for the not-for-profit sector from the Australian Institute of Company Directors as one of a section of governance practices that the church could draw from. And you'll see in a minute that that's one of the elements that we did. And we found a high level of congruence between those expectations, norms, principles, practices in the civil world, as well as in the ecclesial world. So to make this come to life, the ACBC and CRA, and initially in relation to the entire Royal Commission report, created the Implementation Advisory Group, and that was chaired by Jack de Groot and had I think a very significant membership of mainly lay Catholics. But that group felt that the review of governance was such a major piece of work that they would create a second group to do the work. And that group was chaired by Justice Neville Owen. And as you've probably been told before, so I won't dwell on it, but you had membership of people from around Australia, a small number, including John Warhurst, who has spoken to you. But significantly, and this is what I did want to focus on, is that the professors Miriam Wylens, Massimo Fagioli and Richard Lennen, who has spoken to you in the first of this series, were invited. And there is a diocesan priest, Brendan Reid, whose PhD from the Catholic University of Leuven, looks at issues of Catholicity and was really highly relevant. So he made it in with the international experts, although he's Melbourne-based. And the process that we used was that the original group, we met for a period of about 14 months, and we provided a draft. We wrote the draft report. We provided it to our experts once they had agreed to contribute. And then in an extraordinary matter of timing, we invited them to Australia to be hothoused with us for a week. And that was the first week of March 2020. They started in Melbourne with seminars for people in Melbourne on the Sunday, and then we all flew to Sydney. And again, in a sort of a moment of deep irony, we were housed for a week in what's now a commercial accommodation site, but it's the Manly Quarantine Centre, as it's called. By the end of that week, Australia was going into lockdown. Massimo Fagioli and Richard Lennen, who had been invited to the Vatican to an invitation-only seminar on the future of the priesthood, took the decision to fly back and not fly back to the United States. And Miriam got, if you like, trapped in Australia for a few weeks. I don't think it was a hardship posting. I think she quite enjoyed it and managed to stay on. So we had huge benefit from those people, like highly expert and I think you'll see it, those of you who've had a chance to read the report, the ecclesiology of Richard Lenan, the theology of Miriam Wylans, the church history from Massimo Foggioli, and the concepts of Catholicity and what it means to be a Catholic today from Brendan Reid, really did enrich our work. So the ACBC response was largely positive, as you would know, not entirely. And there wasn't support for the creation of a National Leadership Centre, although I think that has been somewhat rethought in the interim, and we can come back to that issue if you like, because particularly for those of you involved in PJPs, this is a significant issue for the Association of Ministerial PJPs, but for anyone working in a Catholic ministry, as we have fewer people in consecrated life, we know that for those of us who want to carry forward their work in the service of the church, we need the formation to assist us to do that. We looked at ecclesial and civil governance principles, and we were looking at including the enhanced need for accountability and transparency, because as you know, when the Royal Commission looked at the incidence of abuse, it found that in all of the institutions, but there was a singling out of church institutions, there was a lack of accountability and transparency, and in some churches, including the Catholic Church, the authority structures were such that it was possible for the individual crime of sexual abuse to become systemic. And that's what was needed to be addressed. So now we're starting to see a little light in our images, give us a sense of moving into the light as day breaks. Moving then to, as I noted, the ecclesial and civil governance principles. And you'll note that we will come to synodality in particular, because co-responsibility is in the title of this presentation that I'm giving. But the notion of subsidiarity, one could say, is not dissimilar to a democratic notion. I think the approach to discernment that the church has, it is certainly being borrowed in many governance settings in civil life, but I do think that that's a very special gift, I suppose, that we have, and we're always happy to share. But coming to informed decision making in the light of prayer and reflection and space for the Holy Spirit to guide our actions. And we can come back to that, if you like, in relation to the plenary council and synodality, because significant for both. Integrity, dialogue, accountability, and morality. They're all there if you look through ecclesial norms and practices. And this is clearly not an exhaustive list on either side. When you look at the civil engagement and consultation, very high on any government's agenda when they're particularly bringing in new approaches and new policies. Responsibility and liability, and that's a core part of the Westminster system, but also those of us who've worked in civil entities, and it's written into our law. Very significant that we know about that. Right decision making, making decisions in the light of whatever it might be, human rights principles, national child safe standards, environmental, social and governance principles, and so on. Integrity, transparency and accountability, much more elevated in civil entities than in church entities, and we can come back to that. And that's what's regarded as needing improvement in church entities. And ethics, and they are, this is not the exclusive domain of churches. You will see, particularly in government and not-for-profit entities, a real focus on ethics. So a little more light then is starting to creep into our discussions as we think about, well, if we had improved transparency, accountability, what might it look like? So looking at some of the key findings that are relevant to today's topic from the Light from the Southern Cross. We found that leadership formation is limited, and you know, we can go into that if you like, but very much so. And so an area where we can see huge benefit for expansion, and styles vary across dioceses and parishes, and that's because certainly in the absence of formation and with the authority vested in the person of the priest or the bishop, you can have significant variability, probably more so than when there are norms of practice, as there are, say, in the codes for the public service or large companies who have codes of conduct and professional associations. When we wrote the report, only 10 of the 30 dioceses in Australia have diocesan pastoral councils. And that's one means of co-responsibility. It's not the only means, but it's an important means of church, lay people in church having a voice, but also contributing to the shape and direction of either the parish or the diocese. Many church processes, such as the appointments of bishops, are opaque. And areas such as full financial reporting are limited. I might add, it was very interesting that I didn't perhaps mention that we had in attendance on that first week of March 2020, 2 people from the Leadership Roundtable in the United States. And they did make a contribution. They were there more in an observer capacity, but they made a good contribution. And amongst the information that they provided is that there is a much higher rate of full financial reporting from dioceses in the United States than there is in Australia. They were somewhat shocked, actually, at the limited amount here in Australia. So then we could go on that while parish finance and pastoral councils are effective means of transparency and accountability, as well as co-responsibility, we need them to be established and then, you know, well run. So a little more light creeping into our discussions. So some of the specific recommendations that are relevant here: integrity, accountability and transparency be reflected in the administrative and governance practices of all church bodies. Those in leadership roles in the church be expected to adopt an inclusive, ethical culture, strong in risk management practices, and effective engagement and communication. And we were seeing the engagement and communication in many ways as if you like, the softer governance principles. They're still, they're often not cited, but they're important in terms of how entities engage with those for whom they have either oversight or responsibility. That the church agencies be models of fiduciary oversight and effective administrative practice. And it's certainly been a feature of the Pontificate of Francis, including drawing Cardinal Pell to Rome to get that work started, but more recently signing up to the governance entities of the European Union, being very upfront, publishing their annual accounts. And for ecclesiastical offices for which no ordination is required, and without limiting the rights of clerics to take up the position, bishops in Australia commit to appointing suitably qualified lay people where practical. And we know that in some dioceses that is happening, and it's good to see. So again, a little bit more, even getting to midday and sun on the oversight. So then some more of the specific recommendations: accountability, transparency, and integrity be reflected in administrative practices. Hang on, I've gone backwards. Sorry. These are, I will go on because I've taken you through those. So we're now starting, we're maturing in our thinking, going toward the sunset. Some of you would recognise that as Mindle Beach in the Northern Territory. And then finally, and this is to give us a bit of time to have some reflection on these issues. Some of the issues are that the existing diocesan and parish authority and decision-making structures, where the authority is vested in the person of the bishop or priest, and certainly enshrined in canon law, makes it more difficult unless the bishop is predisposed or the parish priest is predisposed that way. Bearing in mind that the Light from the Southern Cross was to look at parishes and dioceses. Interestingly, as Anne noted, I'm sitting on one of the commissions planning the Synod on Synodality. And when the opening was held in Rome in October last year, after the opening presentations, we moved into, I'd like to say small groups, but some of them were 20 people. But anyway, we moved into groups for discussion. And in the group that I was facilitating, we had quite a number of people from religious institutes. It was very interesting what they were able to contribute in terms of their governance arrangements and how much more inclusive they were. The mere fact that you had a rollover of personnel after a set term, 5 years or whatever, caps on terms, the fact that the person who'd been in the leadership role returns to a community role and so on. Generally more explicit governance practices written down, going back to St. Benedict and on. So there's plenty there that I think diocesan and parish structures could take. And it's interesting in the planning for this Synod on Synodality, of the commissions, there's a Theology Commission, Spirituality Commission, Methodology, which is the work of ease, and Communications. And the Spirituality Commission is contributing quite a lot in terms of the different charisms that could enrich the church. When we look in Australia, and Australia really is at the head of the pack with this, that most religious institutes are moving to the creation of ministerial public juridic persons with civil and canonical structures. So they're typically creating themselves as a company limited by guarantee under the Corporations Act, as well as a ministerial public juridic person. But that gives them defined accountabilities. So whether it's to ASIC, to the ACNC, they've already got accountabilities to funding bodies, to professional and accrediting bodies, and so on. So within those ministries, there's really very significant accountabilities. And this, of course, and high levels of transparency. And this is what the Royal Commission was recommending that the diocesan and parish structures look to. As I noted earlier, Pope Francis has moved to increased financial and safeguarding accountability, along with the move to synodality or co-responsibility. And this is including in the curial appointments. So as recently as the last few weeks ago, those of you who read La Croix would have seen last week that when the Pope met with the members of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, he is now requiring them to provide an annual update to him on the moves that are being taken in Catholic entities around the world in terms of the protection of minors, and it's now vulnerable people. So that's a very, that he's wanting that accountability back to him. But also on the 29th of March, he issued a document on the restructure of the Curia, and that, of course, was years in the making, multiple versions consulted upon, but including in some of the more significant recommendations are that you don't have to be a cleric to head up one of the Roman departments called dicasteries. You can be a lay person or a religious person, but you can also significantly be being a lay person, you can be a woman. So these, they might not, you know, I suppose if you put that out there, you know, in tomorrow's newspapers, people wouldn't necessarily think they were major, but they are in the life of the church significant moves, and they coincide with other moves. And the point I'd like to make in relation to this being connected to the Royal Commission report is that, if you recall, the report was released on the 15th of December 2017. It was the Pope's Annus Horribilis. The following year, April, the Pennsylvania grand jury issued its report on sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. The Pope had the Chilean bishops resigning en masse because of their mishandling, and on it went. There were revelation after revelation. And the Pope wrote the letter to the people of God in August 2018. And in that letter was pretty much saying to us, those of us who are, well, we're all people of God, whether we're ordained or consecrated into religious life, but by dint of our baptism, but saying, you are needed to create the church of the future, because we can't do it without you. You're a critical part of it. We can talk more about that later, because the Pope's spoken at great length about the people of God, and particularly with the support of church historians, reclaiming this as part of the earliest church, going back a couple of millennia to the Acts of the Apostles and to the ways in which the earliest church communities operated. But we know that this will take behavioural and cultural elements, and all of these take time to change. But the culture of secrecy that has been part of the church for many years, and it is changing. As I mentioned, the publication of financial reports from the Vatican is very significant, and leadership to other parts of the Catholic Church. I think what might take longer is the culture of clericalism as it was identified in the Royal Commission report, but also has been singled out by the Pope, which is a two-way relationship where over probably centuries, more than decades, the lay people have adopted a posture with the ordained of civility, well, hopefully CIVILITY, as well as SERVILITY, and partly due to the nature of canon law, there's authority and power vested in the role of the bishop and the priest, which, unless that person has a inclusive approach, can be exclusive and make it difficult for the regular lay people to contribute in a truly co-responsible way. So then that leaves us looking to formation, commitment to good governance structures and processes, and a culture of ongoing reflection and improvement as some of the ways forward. And no doubt we'll talk more of those when we get to the Q&A session. So we've been through the light of the day and finishing on a full moon, still providing some light from the Southern Cross. Thank you. So,
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. Very grateful to you for unpacking the process that got us here with the Light from the Southern Cross, key findings, specific recommendations from that report, and identifying issues for church entities. Susan, I just wonder, before if we move to Claire, we've just received one question, and I thought I might take this opportunity to ask you just one question. And the question is whether you have any comment on the Light from the Southern Cross and its, I suppose, not featuring in the Plenary Council documents and outcomes document. Is that something that you would be happy to just comment on briefly now or come back to later?
I'm happy to now if it's been raised. I'm not a member of the Plenary Council myself, but I have I've heard that although I gather although it wasn't identified as a core document, it has informed some of the thinking. I think there's still a lot in it. It's only was only provided in 2020, so it's still fairly current. And I do see a high level of congruence between the findings that we reached and the approach to synodality that the current synod is in. And can I make the point in relation to the current synod? Unlike earlier synods that were exclusively a synod of bishops, In his opening address on the 9th of October last year, the Pope was really very clear that this has a strong ecclesial dimension. It's not just episcopal. So this is for all of the church. And he used a very catchy phrase, baptism is your identity card. So you are entitled to a life in the church and to be a contributor to the life of the church if you are baptized. Now, culture and practice has been such over many years that the lay people have stood to the sides. And I think we now have the invitation to have a much more, what's the word, like a co-responsible role. This is not a takeover. This is not diminishing the authority of the bishop or the priest. This is about working with. And if we have time later, I'd be very happy to describe a parish. I was asked to do a review of in fact, I've done 3 diocesan reviews, but a more recent one, where I think you can see that if you've got a bishop who has a disposition toward co-responsibility, you can have extraordinary involvement and draw in the gifts of all of the people. So going back to the original question, I know I've gone around a bit. I do think it ought to be the second assembly. I think there's nothing to stop individual participants drawing on their views from the Light from the Southern Cross and drawing it into the discussions that they have as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. The Pope certainly has a way, I think, of words that bring us in. You know, the baptism is your identity card, I think is a really significant and simple statement that we can all really understand. But your point about the limitations that have been created because of cultural practices, I think is really helpful. So thank you for what you've shared with us, and we will come back to you later on for further conversation with you. So now I'd like to welcome Claire Victory to this conversation. So Claire is the Director of National Council of Australia St Vincent de Paul Society. She's been involved with the Society since she was a child and is the President currently. In that capacity, she also serves on the Society's International Board, where she helps lead the Society's efforts to improve internal governance and safeguarding practices. She's a member of the Plenary Council. Claire also works as a solicitor in private practice in Adelaide, specialising in employment and workers' compensation. During her time as President at Innies, and especially since the first assembly of the Plenary Council, Claire has been approached by many Catholics who feel otherwise excluded from or disillusioned with the Church, but who feel an affinity with Vinnie's work in advocating for those on the margins of our society. Claire is passionate about helping to bring about a more just and compassionate Australia and a more welcoming and inclusive Church. And Claire's topic today is good governance, good works, the opportunity for the Church to be a force for good in Australia. So Claire, welcome. We'll spotlight you so that people can see you well, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's an honour and a privilege to be invited to speak to you all. It's also incredibly daunting. Unlike Susan, I'm not an expert in the Light from the Southern Cross report or on church governance. I do have some thoughts I'd like to share, and so I'm grateful for this opportunity. And I understand that the purpose of this series is to sort of spark conversation, so I'm hoping I can at least do that. So first of all, some context in terms of where I'm coming from. I'm a 38-year-old Catholic woman living on the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, and I pay my respects to the past and present elders of this land and of the lands around Australia. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that our Indigenous brothers and sisters still suffer the effects of colonisation and genocide to this day. I also acknowledge my privilege as a young, white, cisgender, heterosexual, English-speaking, educated, non-disabled Australian woman. I've lived my whole life in the Adelaide Archdiocese. I've been involved in many different ministries and events in that time. I've been a reader and a Eucharistic minister and an altar server and a leader of Children's Liturgy. I've travelled to World Youth Day. I've been involved in the activities of the Diocesan Office for Youth in my diocese. I've been part of a parish that was like an extended family to me, and I've served on a parish pastoral council many years ago. I've found myself leaving a parish when I couldn't abide by the form of leadership demonstrated by the parish priest. And I've spent a lot of years as a bit of a parish nomad with no particular parish to call home, but, you know, attending Mass in places that I find joyful and welcoming, and, you know, depending on where my friends and family are and things like that. I'm also a solicitor. I've been in private practice for 14 years, but only now for another 2.5 days, and then I'm doing something different. I act primarily for employers, including Catholic agencies, other not-for-profits, organisations, corporations, small businesses and government agencies, mostly in the areas of industrial, workplace safety and injury law. I've served on a school board. I've been a member of Vinnie's National Council for the past 11 years, including the last 3 as chair. I'm a member of the International Board. I'm a member of the Interim Diocesan Pastoral Council and a member of the Plenary Council. I've served on boards and committees with people older than me, younger than me. I've mentored and been mentored, and I spent a few years running an ice hockey club as well. So with all of that said, any views I express today are obviously my own and not reflective of any of those organisations. I just want to give you a snapshot of where I'm coming from when I'm sort of giving my views today. So when I think about governance, I think about the interplay between structure, policies and processes on the one hand, and, you know, the relationships and culture and leadership on the other. And by that, I mean that governance can't just be understood as a set of rules or documents or bureaucratic processes. And it's also not just about power or exercising authority. It's really the way that mission and values inform policies and actions. It's about how humans shape and utilise the rules and policies and apply them to human situations. And it's about the way that we relate to each other as we work towards a common goal. The Light from the Southern Cross report describes governance as the system of rules, relationships and practices by which authority and control are exercised within organisations. And I think that's a pretty good definition, really. And as explained in the report, when we look at contemporary civil governance principles, we see some particular elements: integrity, accountability and transparency, risk management, culture and ethics, consultation, inclusiveness and participation, clear communication and right relationships. And emphasised throughout the report is this key concept, which is that accountability is a critical element of good governance, and accountability demands openness and transparency. And I think we all understand something about openness and transparency in terms of things like making meeting minutes and financial documents available for inspection, publishing annual reports and regular updates so that stakeholders and the general public have insight into what we're doing, having clear complaints processes so that people can provide feedback and so on. I think that's all pretty well understood. And I think there are some ways in which the church is doing really good things in the transparency space. You know, our ongoing safeguarding efforts, you know, the work done by the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network. Those are things that sort of immediately come to mind as examples of the church as an organisation going, okay, we know we're not perfect and there's risks that we are doing harm or could be doing harm. So we really need to scrutinise ourselves, our own practices, supply chains and all of that, and ensure that we're open and honest about what we're doing and what we find, and then commit to fixing it. And, you know, I love the phrase that Susan used in her presentation about sunlight being the best disinfectant. I think that's so true. But I think the element of openness and transparency that I'm a bit more interested in and I've been thinking about a lot lately, and that I'm not sure necessarily gets enough attention, is the personal openness and transparency required of leaders. So as Catholics, and particularly for me as a Vincentian, we consider the ideal form of leadership to be servant leadership. The Light from the Southern Cross report contains a quote from Cardinal Dew of Wellington describing Pope Francis, and it's an excellent articulation of that form of leadership. The quote is as follows: "He leads out of his own inner authority, sure of who he is before God and content to be who he is. He is content to be a flawed human being, flawed but still chosen because of the goodness of God's mercy and grace. He sees, listens, and hears. He has complete trust in God and keeps on going. I have been privileged to see him lead with courage, conviction, and compassion." And so there's some really key features that jump out there: courage, conviction, compassion, but also flawed. Okay, it speaks of leadership as not about knowing all the answers, not claiming special knowledge or expertise. It talks of true leadership being about not knowing all the answers. It's about being committed to searching for answers and acknowledging in that our own limitations and seeking help and guidance from others. It's about recognising gifts and also experiences, life experiences that others might have that can contribute to that search for answers and for truth. It's about keeping sight of the personal in the midst of the protocol, and it's about exercising good judgment, not passing judgment. I think you can contrast that to clericalism, which involves, claiming special expertise and authority based on a particular role or status in the church. And the report makes clear that clericalism really is the enemy of collaborative, transparent, and accountable systems of governance. So those two models, that servant leadership and clericalism, are evident in the church in Australia. We know that, and the plenary council process and surrounding dialogue has really highlighted that. But to a degree, a similar dichotomy between, I guess, the secular versions of those concepts has, in my view at least, really come to the fore in recent times in our civil society and governments. I think if we look to society at this point in time, personal transparency and the form of accountability that it engenders is increasingly the norm and the expectation. People under the age of 40 today have lived our entire lives in a very globalised, connected world. We've been on the internet since at least high school. We've been on social media from at least early adulthood. So privacy is difficult to come by, and anonymity is essentially impossible. There's many and varied downsides to that often discussed, elsewhere. But I think there's also benefits to that degree of openness, forced openness, I guess. So it means that my colleagues and acquaintances don't have to look too far to find, embarrassing statuses that I posted on Facebook in 2008, or, the embarrassing music that I listened to as a teenager, and those sorts of things. And, if there was any crush that wanted to Google me, they'd find lots of terrible photos waiting for them on the internet. But it also means that my values, my personality, my works, all of those things are there for people to see. So there's that forced openness there that I think people of my age and younger have come to expect. And I think it translates to a different form of leadership than that which we're accustomed to seeing in community, political, and church leaders from perhaps earlier generations. And so what does it look like? It looks like, the new South Australian Premier doing Facebook Live videos from his lounge room while he was at home with COVID. It's Grace Tame talking about her personal trauma and refusing to play nice when invited to, attend official events. It's President Zelensky talking directly to his people and the world on Instagram in the middle of a war. Now, for people like me, youngish female professionals with an interest or involvement in law and politics, 2020, 2021 felt challenging in a fairly new and specific kind of way. Men's violence against women is nothing new, and nor is workplace sexual harassment. But in that period, we saw so many dreadful and really relatable experiences of and examples of workplace sexual violence, and that was in the South Australian legal profession, in the High Court, and in federal Parliament, and that was sort of quite overwhelming. the particularly disheartening thing about it was what it showed us about leadership, and especially about the lack of leadership, which were present in those places, and which was so evident in these people that had always been held up as the very epitome of, leadership, rich, powerful, well-educated, white, cisgendered, heterosexual men, judges, ministers, these people with these unblemished records, which were really only unblemished because their records were hidden, thanks to years of secrecy, collusion, spin, and the boys' club, doing what it does best. So we sort of knew all that stuff was happening. It just, I don't know, it just really sucked to see it, the extent to which it was still like that, despite women having more of a say, despite having more brilliant, qualified and confident women in places like the courts and Parliament. But through all of it, I think there's a lot of us, again, people sort of in my cohort, who recognise that form of leadership, those people, mostly men in those positions, that wasn't leadership. Like they're not leaders. We saw a new wave of leaders emerge, leaders that we were drawn to and chose. Young women who had no privacy left, who didn't rely on spin but relied on substance, whose very lives and even bodies had been laid bare and opened up for public consumption, but who showed courage by saying, this is my personal experience, this is my trauma, my personal pain, and we need to do better. These emerging leaders, they're not prime ministers or attorneys general or judges or executives. They're advocates, journalists, ordinary people with life experiences and stories to share, propelled into the spotlight, not necessarily willingly, but also they're not willing to simply smile politely and stay quiet once they're there. Now, these emerging leaders, these women, are saying the same things that many women had said before them, and undoubtedly they received more of a hearing by virtue of being middle class, white and well-educated, and pretty. But I think there's also something about seeing in such stark contrast and in real time the failure of leadership alongside the very real and raw consequences of that failure. We were seeing the failed leaders alongside, the victims and their emerging leadership. So these victims, survivors, advocates, allies are people with personalities and personal flaws and histories, all of which are there for the world to see. By virtue of their age and the fact that they want to live and lead authentically, they didn't seek or ascend to power through cover-ups or spin or marketing. From the outset, we've known these people's history, their trauma, their drug taking, their sexuality, how they feel about people, because they tell us in speeches and in tweets, and in, very public offerings of, very impressive side-eye. And again, they demonstrate the qualities of good servant leaders. They display courage, conviction, compassion, and they're flawed, and they're open about that. They're not all-knowing or all-powerful, but they're determined to listen and learn, share their mutual humanity with all of its imperfections. And, that's the model of leadership that is needed, appreciated, and admired today. At least that's what I see. Again, it's not about knowing all the answers. It's about listening to others and acknowledging our own flaws and limitations, leading with courage and conviction and compassion. Aside from the policies and processes and reporting and the like, I think that form of leadership, that willingness to be open about our humanity with all its flaws, offers up this whole extra form and degree of accountability and transparency that we need, and that's what people want to see today. It's what people are increasingly expecting from the leaders that they choose, the leaders that they're drawn to. So what's the opportunity here for us? The church has a great story to tell about the value and dignity of human life and how we should treat each other and how we should treat our planet. Currently, we lack the moral authority, though, because people can smell hypocrisy from a mile off. People in civil society, for the most part, I think, don't dismiss or condemn the church or criticise or attack its institutions because they fundamentally disagree with our beliefs or think that having faith in God is silly. They dismiss and condemn and criticise and attack because we're seen to judge and criticise others and exclude others when they're the very things that we're telling the community not at large not to do. we don't practice what we preach. You know, we don't do internally what we tell people externally they should be doing in the world. We judge, and so we too are judged. The inclusion of the full range of human experience within an organisation, any organisation, the breadth and depth of lived experience with all its successes and talents and flaws and failings and trauma makes that organisation better informed and more effective. An organisation is better when its leadership reflects its constituents' parts and those that it seeks to serve, and that's definitely true of our church. Reaching out to and including those who are currently marginalised or excluded from our society and from our church isn't just about charity or doing the right thing by those people. It's actually about enriching the collective and improving our leadership and governance by including as many different types of voices and human life experiences as possible. As a church, we need to strive always for transparency and accountability, but that needs to extend to the sort of personal transparency and accountability that I've just described in our leaders. We need leaders to be showing their own humanity with all their flaws and failings, and in doing so, show and demonstrate true welcome and acceptance of others who have their own flaws and failings. And that sort of approach will, I think, enable our leaders to be the type of leaders that people in Australia want and expect in 2022. And that's especially true of younger people, women, and people who are currently excluded from society, and people who care about their neighbours and the earth. I think that's what people want to see. I think we have a real opportunity to increase and improve that personal transparency and accountability in our leaders, and thereby give the church the moral authority it needs to be really a force for good in the community as it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I'm really grateful to you for sharing your experiences with us and your thoughts on church thinking, church actions, but also how leadership is lived out in secular society, how we live our personal truths, either quietly or out in the open, and what impact that has in leadership, and the difference between the formal leadership within secular society and church as opposed to the new emerging leaders you're talking about who are becoming leaders through their own circumstance and experience, and the transparency that inherently comes with that. So thank you very much for the thought you've obviously put into this, and for, I suppose, also your honesty and exposing yourself through your thinking with this group. That's what we like to encourage, is the reflection from hearing other people's stories, experiences, thoughts, how that encourages us to reflect and learn more about ourselves and hear where the Spirit's calling us. So thank you, Claire. I have one question that, again, Claire, for you to think about whether you want to address now or later on. And the question is, do you think the legal and financial structures of the church might be forced to change due to issues of transparency, accountability, governance, and community attitudes? So that's in the chat, Claire, if you want to read that again. But I'll read it. Do you think the legal and financial structures of the church might be forced to change because of transparency, accountability, governance, and community attitudes? Would you like to just speak to that now, or think about it?
Yeah, I can speak briefly to it now, I guess. I mean, I think the obvious answer is yes. If through I guess the auditing and checking that we should always be doing on how we're acting as an organisation. Through that, if we're finding obviously harm, risks, and those sorts of things, then it is likely that that part of the answer to those things is to make changes in in our structures and those sorts of things. So I mean, I think that's a yes. In terms of changing due to community attitudes, I think sort of as I was saying at the end there, how the community sees the church is instructive. You know, if we're seeing that people in the community see the church as hypocritical, you know, not tolerant, not welcoming, a body that excludes people, then that should be, and it is, I think, a wake-up call to us to look at, you know, what we're doing and how we need to improve. You know, certainly legal and financial structures, I think a lot of people don't understand when it comes to the church. I think, you know, people don't have a good sort of visibility of all of those things and how those things work. And, you know, again, it's best for everyone if people can understand and they have that visibility and can see what we're doing and that we're open about it. And we shouldn't be needing to hide anything. So why would we? So I don't know if that really answers the question as such. They're just things that immediately come to mind in response to that question, but also happy to give it some more thought and come back to it in the later session. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Claire. I mean, I agree that with everything that you've said on that point, I think that there have been changes already in legal and financial structures in the church because of Royal Commission. I think because, as Susan mentioned, religious institutes, some of them have moved towards more corporate structures while also holding on to the mission of their charism. They're holding on to their charism, which inherently leads to, you know, more accountability and transparency because of the being a company. But I also think there's a real discussion, live discussion around the church of applying all of these requirements, transparency, accountability, good governance practice, in a way that gives life to the church, co-responsibility, synodality. So the numbers of people in the parish itself reflects community attitudes, and I hope will lead to some of that change, which of course people are looking to plenary council as well as the changes that religious institutes and others are making within their organisations. So thank you.
Certainly we've seen that example with St Vincent de Paul, with, you know, increasingly moving to different corporate structures and those sorts of things. Now, partly that is to keep up with you know, regulatory requirements and those sorts of things, but it also enables you to increase the diversity, for example, in the organisation. You know, you might be used to having a particular type of people on all your governing committees because you know, that's who ends up there in the society for a number of years. It was generally retired white men. Sometimes the way when you change those structures a bit, because you need to meet sort of regulatory requirements, and you realise, well, we're in real trouble if we don't have the adequate expertise around the table on particular things, it kind of forces you to maybe look at different people from different experiences, and then increase the diversity, younger people, women, people in different professions, all those sorts of things. So it's certainly something that we've been experiencing and are continuing to experience in the way that we sort of do things and change the way we do things.
Yeah, it's always good to hear those concrete examples of changes that have, so the conversations, I think, the questions that are being asked are really leading to a lot of changes. So thank you. So now we're going to take a break for 45 minutes. As I said before, it's a time for you to reflect, think about what's relevant for you, what touches you, what resonates, and maybe take some prayer time and come back at we'll say 10 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. It was to be 45 minutes, so we'll do, I think that's 35 minutes, so hopefully that's okay, just so we don't keep you later. And if you've got any questions or comments, send through to Sylvia, please. Thank you all, and we will see you back at 10 to 1 Eastern Standard Time.